when I choose an opening or a defense, and I start to think about it, a lot of thoughts go through my mind. For example, I'm always, wherever I go, I'm asked the question, how do I improve? How do I get better? What books would you recommend? What can I do to speed up my learning process? All of these things. Well, I don't really have the answers so much as I can share with you the experiences I've had. So one of the things we need to do is very carefully think about the openings we choose. If we choose the move e4, before we even choose the move e4, we have to understand that this is most likely the oldest move in chess, and therefore the most well-mapped move in chess. In other words, if our opponents are competent to good to even excellent players, they're going to have a specialized system against 1e4. So we have to anticipate that not only must we have a very, very broad knowledge of a large number of defenses, but even we should have something for any type of defense we might get hit with. We might get hit with a French defense. We might get hit with an Alekhines. We might get hit with a Scandinavian. A classical e5. We might get hit with a Perk. We might even get hit with an English kind of system. The George, what is that? The George, St. George? St. George variation, A6, B5. A Sicilian. In other words, there are a lot of openings that we could come up against. And the same for D4 and so on. So one of the things that I like to stress to people who are in my shoes, coming up and trying to improve their play and understand how they could become better players more rapidly, is to think about the opening choices they make and to look at the opening choices they make as well as their defenses from what I call the skeletal point of view. In other words, the pawn structure. Yeah? So, how many of you play the French defense? How many of you who play e4 have played against the French defense? Okay. Well, the French defense is typified by the move e6, d4, d5, and e5. This is basically the French defense structure, yes? How you get here, the knight may be here, the knight may be here. This, of course, is called the advanced French defense with e5 on move 3. But the essence is that we have a pawn structure in the center that looks like this. It's fixed. In fact, the pawns are locked up. So if we were going to play this position for white or for black, what I would be doing is I would be removing all the pieces off the back rank. And I would be looking from the position of the pawn skeleton. That is to say, there's only 8 pawns on the board. And when I look at the pawn skeleton, it really helps me try to understand simple things. In other words, I say the pawn structure is going to tell you what you have to do. So if we just include, pardon me, just for the moment, 2 other moves, we have c5, c3. And if we were just to continue, I'm not saying that pawn takes is the right way, but if we just were to take a look at this structure, there's a few things I would say to myself. Well, what do I like about the structure for white, or conversely, what do I like about the structure for black? Michael?
Question, wouldn't the c4 pawn advance lock up the queen side, favoring black, neutralizing?
Yes, you could.
Lock up the queen side c4.
Very, yes, exactly. Very, very good point, that you could do the advance and try to get some space on the queen side, no question. And in fact, we'll come right back to that for a moment. What I like to do is I like to look at the potential middle game plans, based just on the skeleton. So the first thing I do when I look at a position like this, I say, well, the only open file is a C file. Very, very simple. I'm going to put my rook on C1. Just bring my rook on C1. I like white space. I like the fact that this pawn on E5 and this pawn on D4 controls more of the center, more of the space than black. I like the idea that this pawn on E5 controls these two outposts, square D6, square F6. I like the fact that this pawn on D4 controls square C5. So I begin to think in my simplified imagination that, gosh, it would really behoove me to put a knight on any of these three squares. They would be protected squares, they would be attacking black's camp. It's strange. I'm looking at the position and I think to myself, my goodness, look at this. I notice that my pawns, the white pawns, are in D4 and E5. Don't they block in my dark squared bishop? Wouldn't it make sense that if I could follow it up like this, I would want to exchange, to trade my dark squared bishop, because I know that with my pawns on E5 and D4, my bishop could become a bad bishop or somewhat passive bishop. I look at it from the black side, black point of view. And I said, well, where are my outposts? I'm black. I've got to have something going for me. It can't all be bad. Well, I look and I say F5, ideal square, E4, ideal square, C4, ideal square. I'm also tempted by another thought. I kind of think to myself, wow, wouldn't this be cool if I were black and I could play the move F7, F6, attacking this pawn on E5. I would make a trade one day, and in the resulting position, I would have a protected pass pawn. Hey, that's pretty cool. That's maybe something I could aspire towards. I kind of like that idea. So suddenly this idea of F7, F6 starts to be a consideration that I want to keep in mind. Also, from black's point of view, I think to myself, oh my goodness, if what I've said about white's dark square bishop is true, then it must be doubly true for black's light squared bishop. That in fact the pawns on E6 and D5 are constricting me, and I might have trouble one day playing with the light squared bishop. It might behoove me to perhaps consider a line like B7, B6, and bishop A6 in order to trade light squared bishops. Or maybe I should consider a maneuver like queen B6, bishop here and bishop here. Again, with a similar idea of trading light squared bishops. So in other words, I just think about the pawn structure and try in my simplified imagination to construct plans. As Michael pointed out, I might even consider that in a position like this, wouldn't it make a great deal of sense for me to play a move like C5, C4? I would gain space on the queen side, and maybe I could follow it up with a move B5, B4, and so forth and so on. In other words, I look at the position from the skeletal point of view. We're going to go back and imagine another popular structure today. C5 becomes one of the most popular defenses, the Sicilian defense. And one of the most popular structures for black in the Sicilian defense is kind of what is called a Scheveningen pawn structure. And it looks like this from black's point of view. With or without the move a7, a6. Doesn't really matter, but we get a structure like this. d6, e6, 3 nice guys. e4, 3 nice guys, 3 nice guys. And again, I start trying to construct nice ideas from both sides. Well, the first thing I identify from Black's point of view is he's got this half-open C file. This half-open C file. It makes a great deal of sense to my mind that I'm going to play rook a8, c8 quite quickly. And after playing rook a8, c8, a consequence might be to sacrifice an exchange against c3, capture a pawn on e4. From White's point of view, White sees this pawn on d7, d6, and hey, wait a minute, it's a potential weakness. First of all, there's a half-open d file from White's point of view. It makes a great deal of sense for White to play rook on a1 to d1, and maybe with moves like knight b5 or even bishop f4 to target the pawn on d7, d6. In other words, I'm just looking from a skeletal point of view what plans might develop from the pawn structure. From this particular pawn structure, I consider what are the outposts? Can somebody tell me what Black's outpost for his knight might be?
Just give you an idea that since there's an inhibited position of the white CD area, I think it's a possibility for Black to do a long-term fianchetto with the bishop with the stronger knight move. Because if you look at the two knights, they're kind of bound in a funny way, not protecting each other. And there's also constriction here. So if you could consider long-range fianchetto with attack with the bishop and combined with your pawns, Black can probably equalize this game and take the advantage.
Oh, exactly. I mean, it's very often, very, very often, Black does try to fianchetto his bishop. Both bishops, in fact, somehow get fianchettoed in classical shenanigans. But the question I was asking is just from Black's point of view, from his pawn structure, what are his outposts for his knights? Julian. E5? C5. That's right. But you were reluctant, with understandable reason, to suggest e5 and c5. c5 you could have suggested right away that would be a very reasonable outpost indeed for a knight, and you do in fact see the knight coming very often to c5. You were a little bit reluctant to say e5, possibly, probably, because you felt that it wasn't a real outpost, as there's always this f2, f4 move that could kick your knight back. From White's point of view, what's a natural outpost for White's knights? Well, remarkably, there isn't one. I mean, at least in the direct term, when we look at the pawn on e4, we say the natural outpost for the knights are f5 and d5. But wait a minute, neither square is available. So suddenly, to win controls of those squares, we have to conceive that a likely idea will be f4, f5. Why? Because we want to provoke the pawn to e5 so that we can take possession of the d5 square, or because this knight being on d4 is putting pressure on the e6 pawn, we might want to follow it up with bishop c4. So again, whatever opening, whatever defense that you conceive, take a look from the skeletal point of view. Now, at this point, I would like somebody to give me a very consequent line in any opening. Give me a shot. Spencer, pick your favorite defense as Black against 1d4. What's your favorite defense?
Oh, I like to play King's Indian.
Wonderful. So we're going to look at a King's Indian. So when we think about, or at least when I think about a King's Indian defense structure, what I'm really imagining in my mind is a structure that looks like this with or without the pawn on f5. But this to me really does typify the King's Indian defense structure. Okay, so once we've decided that, hey, we're going to choose the King's Indian defense, well, let's get familiar with some of the ideas. If we take all 8 pieces off the board and we just start to think. And again, from my point of view as white, we'll start with white, let's say, I start to think that structurally, I see these marvelous pawns here. I control the center. I have space. I see that this pawn is especially reaching into black's position. I don't really have a natural outpost for a knight. Perhaps the b5 square, keeping in mind c7, c6. Sure. Yeah, but before I even worry about where the knights go from the opening moves, I'm trying to think conceptually of what my strategy might be. One of the things I'm attracted to is the fact that this pawn on c4 and this pawn on d5 actually control a lot of space, and I start being attracted to the opportunity to play c4, c5. Okay, and if I gun, so to speak, for this move c4, c5, in the first place, this could lead potentially to the opening of the c file. So I start to think that, boy, I'd sure like to put a rook on the c file. Also, again, we just start to think about the structure, and we say, well, doesn't this structure inhibit our bishop on f1? And we go, yeah, it actually does. So that move c4, c5 starts to get even more and more attractive. If I could get in the pawn to c5, my bishop might get active and things might happen. I also start to think that, well, should I play the move f2, f4? And I'm a little bit dissuaded by that, because I think that if I play f4 and he captures, haven't I given black an ideal square on e5? Black's point of view. From black's point of view, his outposts are obvious. d4 and f4. I mean, and how many times in actuality King's Indian defense players have played knights to squares d4 and f4? We might also say that this bishop has the potential of being passive thanks to these blockading pawns. f7, f5 is a natural advancement of the pawn to try to attack white in the center. And this is the way that I conceived or chose my openings. One of the things that I really was looking for in an opening was a lock structure, or in other words, a fixed structure. Because I thought fixed structures were the easiest ones to understand. So if we go back, for example, to my mind, the Queen's Gambit declined was a wonderful example of a beautiful kind of fixed structure that I could really sink my teeth into. So we're just going to set up a typical position in the Queen's Gambit declined. Okay, so we just set up this position, and it really seemed to me that I got a very good idea, flavor of the strategies that were going on here for both sides. I thought that thanks to the half-open c-file, it was quite self-evident to me at least that white's rook was going to go to c1, that this idea of a minority attack with b4 and b5 made perfect sense to try to create a weakness on the c6 square. I also liked ideas for white that had the knight jumping to e5. You put the knight on e5, you put your pawn on f4, you castle, and then you do the old rook lift. All of these made perfect sense. I was really, really surprised when later I would discover that this idea of knight e5 and f4 even had its own name. You know the name for the idea, the Philidor Attack? Philidor Attack. You go knight e5, f4, rook castles, rook f3. And so, but that all seemed very natural to me when I was looking from the openings from the skeletal point of view. Black's point of view, well, he has the half-open e-file for his rook. It seems to me that the rook is going to go to e8. You've got the e4 square under control thanks to the knight. The knight would jump to e4, and maybe this bishop would, once the knight was on e4, this bishop would go to f5 or g4. This knight is a little bit strange. On the one hand, it might want to go to d7 to b6, because after all, this is also an outpost. Or, if we imagine that the rook was on e8, we could imagine the knight going to f8 into g6. It was very similar to, say, in the Spanish Ruy Lopez, where white is forever going knight d2, f1 to g3. Well, here it's rook e8 and the knight going to g6. So I began to just form plans, ideas, and tactics that were based on the pawn structure. I want to say, when I was very young, it was much, much easier for me to play openings and defenses that were based on fixed structures, such as the French. Conversely, it was very, very difficult to master or become an expert in openings or defenses that the pawn structure was really, really fluid or dynamic. So let's see, for example, about what I mean by a dynamic structure. Okay, imagine that we have a favorite defense as black, and we're going to call this defense the Pirc defense, because that's what it's called. So the Pirc defense. So we get a defense like this, and as black, I thought this was a very, very difficult defense to master, although I tried my hardest, because in fact, is really a large dynamic number of possibilities here for white. For example, one of the most aggressive and dynamic possibilities is what you might think of as the three-pawner attack, which is called, in fact, the Austrian attack. And after bishop g7, knight f3, c5, dc5, queen a5. This is a massive, massive amount of analysis in this line. Or the line castles, e5, knight d7, h4, c5, h5, takes. This is like another massive variation, full of analysis. Many, many hundreds of games have gone like this. White's going all out for the attack on black's king. And again, as black, you have to know, if you're going to play the Pirc defense, you have to have an idea of how you're going to meet all of these various approaches. Another approach that one fellow played against me is just to play f2, f3. Castles, bishop e3, which is a very, very different approach for white. One of white's ideas is to go queen d2, castles long, and g4, g5. Another variation I've had to face. This is a kind of a very much in-your-face variation. G6, h4. I mean, talk about wanting to kill me, right? Right out of the bat. Bishop g7, h5. Like, go for it, baby. Knight takes h5. Rook takes h5, g takes h5. Just sacrificing in exchange to go after white. Just sacrifices in exchange and just plays the position. That's quite an approach. Another approach, I mean, there's just so many approaches that white can choose. Another approach that has been tried against me is g6, bishop e2, bishop g7, g4. Oh, I mean, this, yeah, the Chinese attack. That's what a Chinese player in the 1978 Olympiad did against Grandmaster Jan-Hein Donner. Just went bishop e2, g4. I have played against Vlatko Kovacevic as black, c5, g5, knight d7, d5, which is very Benoni-ish in its flavor. So this defense, the Perk defense, to my mind, really required a great deal of knowledge because the pawn structure was so fluid, so dynamic. For those of you who play the Alekhine defense, you never know what kind of, it seems to me at least, you never know what kind of pawn structure you're going to get into Alekhine, and your defense has to be very adaptable. For example, against the Alekhine, it seems to me white has choices such as these. Right? Pawn takes. For example, this is a variation. I mean, trades. A very different, unusual pawn structure. On the one hand, you might be very happy to have white, two very beautiful sets of pawns, 3 and 3. Black has 3 pawn islands, these 3 guys, these 2 guys, and this isolated pawn represent 3 different pawn islands. I mean, but very unusual pawn structure. In the Alekhine defense, we just go back. Far more common for the Alekhine, I mean, is e5, knight d5, d4, d6. Now here, white might try something as simple as c4, knight b6, trade pawns like this. So we get one kind of pawn structure. Pardon me. Trade pawns like this. Takes. So we get a very symmetrical, balanced kind of pawn structure. Or we might get a pawn structure like this. Talk. Talk. And in this kind of pawn structure, black has to be always very careful that a d4, d5 doesn't blow you out of the water. So in a sense, what I'm saying is you can bring your openings, as white and as black, down to 2 types of openings. Dynamic pawn structures, or locked or simplified pawn structures. This strikes me as a very, very dynamic pawn structure with lots of, you might get overwhelmed trying to tell me, what are the strengths, the multiple strengths and the multiple weaknesses of both players' positions. I mean, if you were just to add up, say, well, I like this advantage, this simple advantage for white, I like this simple thing for black, but then you keep adding to your list. Michael, I had a question.
Well, in the classical textbooks, don't they refer to these choices, the distinction between a closed system vis-a-vis an open system? Is that
Yeah.
a good description?
No, well, first of all, yes. There used to be an entire classical school that of chess thought that said, there's open positions and there's closed positions. But actually, it's not really that simple. For example, a closed position was widely thought as any position that just simply both sides had 8 pawns. Well, it was closed, but was it really? If the pawns were locked up, it still wasn't closed because one guy might be going for one type of lever, the other guy for another. What do you do about positions where there's a pair of pawns traded? Is that an open position, or does an open position only describe a situation where 2 pairs of pawns have been traded, and hence the position is, quote, wide open or merely open? So as opposed to the distinctions and trying to find a proper definition of a closed or locked, I just went for the dynamic structure versus the not so dynamic. This structure strikes me as very, very dynamic. This structure, conversely, a French defense lock structure, was not very dynamic. It was locked. It was closed. So that was the distinction I was making. To further the point, if you're a very, very, very aggressive player and you needed to win lots and lots of games, you had a very high rating that you wanted to protect by being a decisive killer at the chessboard, you had a 2,500 rating and you were playing a lot of 2,100, 2,200, 2,300 players, you needed to win a lot of the games. Guess what? You're playing dynamic openings because it was incumbent upon you to win many games to protect your rating. Conversely, if you were, like I said, taking up chess, learning chess, just trying to hang in there, so to speak, keep your feet dry, you wanted to play locked, static, simplified pawn structures because it was so very easy to understand the underlying ideas, the strategic principles. So we go back to where I started the lecture. Mr. Seirawan, how do I get better at chess? Now we start to understand how difficult it is for me to answer the question. What's your rating? Are you trying to play dynamically? Have you played dynamically? Have you played statically? Do you understand the ideas? Do you talk to the skeletons in your position? Do you know all the skeletons in your closet? Do you know what the skeletons are trying to tell you? And so we go from there. A moment ago, I asked Spencer to give me one of his favorite defenses, and he called out the King's Indian. So let's go and go a little bit deeper into the King's Indian so you can get a better idea of how I approach the King's Indian. So, if Spencer says to me, Yaz, tonight I'm going to play the King's Indian and I'm playing to kick your butt, I go, okay, I get it. I mean, you want to play rough. You want to play rough. Okay. Well, if we're going to play rough, Spencer and I'm going to bring out my A game. And for me, the A game has always been the same-ish variation. I have a lot of pet lines that I like to play against the King's Indian. I played bishop e2, bishop g5. My absolute favorite is bishop d3, almost kind of a Seirawan system. I played it so often. But the same-ish has always been one of my favorites. Now in this position, in the same-ish, it's very clear what my intention is. Thanks to my pawn being on f3, I want to put my bishop on e3, and I don't want to be bothered. No knight g4. But it's cost me a tempo to fortify my center. Now black, actually, remarkably enough, has a wide variety of ways of meeting the same-ish. He can play 4 lines with c5. he can play for lines with e5, and surprisingly enough, he can play c6, a6, and b5. Spence, your choice. What do you do against the Samish?
I play knight c6, a6.
Okay, so knight c6, bishop e3, castle. Excellent decision. Excellent decision. I always say, like, king's nice and protected. Excellent decision. Castles. So I'm an old pawn grubber, so I'm going to try to play a line of the Samish that, in the great words of international master Nikolai Minev, gift me the pawn. So I'm going to play knight on g to e2. Do you play with a6? Okay. So after a6, I'm going to play knight c1. Do you play with rook b8?
I would.
Yes, rook b8. And so what Spencer's idea with this whole little demonstration on the queen side is what he wants to do is actually keep things fluid in the center. Notice that in a King's Indian, e7, e5 is the most common move. But he's deliberately held back. It's like he said, before I commit myself in the center, I'm going to do some things on the queen side that might prove effective. And I'm sitting there saying, well, from my point of view, I've built up my center, yeah. And remember what I was saying about this bishop? I'm looking forwards to the opportunity of playing c4, c5, so that I can bring my bishop here. So, Spence, your choice.
Probably bishop d7.
Bishop to d7. And now I make the quiet move, queen d2.
Not sure. I think after knight c1 I should have played e5 actually.
Correct.
Yeah.
So after we're going to go back, maybe here. I think, have you castled?
Yeah.
Okay. So in this position, and have I done it right?
Yeah,
One.
a6 and then knight c1.
Okay. So the standard move, as Spence is now recalling, is that he's supposed to play e5. I play d5.
And then knight d4.
Correct, knight d4. So as I was explaining to this class, I'm an old pawn grubber. So I want, first of all, I want very, very much for black to capture this knight so that I could capture with a pawn, and that makes it much easier for me to play b4, b5. The standard move is c5. Would you like to try it?
Sure.
Yes. So the standard move is c5. And if we look at that position, it's self-evident that knight on d4 is awesome. We can't allow that, so I capture en passant. And if you capture with a knight, you have regrets. You have regrets because you have a backward pawn on d6. That is, after I will play queen d2, I'll put pressure. It's much more common for you to capture, and this is where you have boldly sacrificed a pawn. For what? We're not sure yet. But black boldly sacrifices a pawn. Now here, as far as I understand, you have three moves. Rook b8, bishop e6, four moves. Rook b8, bishop e6, rook e8, and d6, d5.
I think in a 1-minute game I played d5 here.
Yeah, exactly. And I think
didn't know.
you didn't know that you were following a long style. Exactly. I think that's very, very important, what just slipped out there. Oftentimes, you just play an opening because it felt right. That's all. You just had a good feeling about your position and it felt right. So a move like d6, d5 feels right. I mean, it's just like, well, that's the good move. Okay, so here, there's a couple of things that I could do. One, I can take the pawn on d5. You would presumably recapture. If I capture this knight on f6, and let's say you recapture with a queen, I play knight takes d5, queen takes b2. That just feels like with the dark square bishops and a safe king, you're doing fine. So the standard move from white's point of view is e4, e5. Standard move from black's point of view is knight d7. You can play rook e8 if you want. I don't think it makes too much of a difference, although I can't absolutely be sure of that. But
I played rook e8 in the...
okay, very good. Rook e8, bishop e2, bishop e2. Now, by the way, I'm still a pawn up. I'm dreaming in my happy fantasy world that I'm going to play f4 and castles and coast my way to a gorgeous, stunning victory.
Like knight h5.
That's exactly. Knight h5 is a very standard move. I castle. So, that's a very good point. So you started to think that if you play bishop takes e5, bishop takes e5, rook takes e5, and recapture your pawn, an extremely good idea, I might add, then after a move like f4, attacking your rook, there's knight on h5, and we have issues. So rather than capture the pawn, and especially is not to allow the move f4, knight f4. So I say, go back, and I keep my pawn. Now you have two choices. I don't really like the move knight h3 check. It feels a little bit artificial and flaky. After, for example, king h1, f4, there's a possibility the knight is simply badly placed. You could go for knight takes e2, queen takes e2, and struggle to regain your pawn. You could go for knight e6 to capture my bishop and capture the pawn. So a lot of choices.
I was planning on taking the bishop because you want to play f4 and so your white's first will be weak.
Precisely so. So you take my bishop. Now here, funnily enough, I could go for a different kind of a battle, right? These are the things that I kind of go through my mind as I think about the opening. Another kind of a battle I might go for is knight takes, bishop takes, rook takes, knight d4. And then conceptually I say, oh, I've got a knight on d4 against a passive, more or less, passive bishop. But I'm an old pawn grubber. I believe in material. So gift me the pawn. Gift me the pawn. Well, that's been the case for a long, long time. So one of the things that should be going through Black's mind is he could consider a line like bishop takes f6. Then bishop takes f6, and oops, that's a tactical accident. Okay, so what about the move f7, f6? And let's just imagine these two moves being played, with or without bishop h3, it doesn't matter. Now when we made the decision to play f7, f6, f4, trade the pawns on e5, something should be going through our mind, a certain realization. What are we doing? We're opening up the f-file. Is that good or bad? Well, the answer... yeah. For white, excellent for white. Well, yeah, but it's white whose rook is on the f-file. So we open up the position against ourselves. So I don't know if maybe, Spence, you want to toss in bishop h3 before f6, or you had another idea.
Rook b8.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, rook b8. Toss that one into the mix. Very, very natural. Now, I don't know, should I play a3? Should I play b3? Should I even bother? I'm not sure. But one thing I am sure about, I do want to have the pawn on f4. I mean, if I'm going to keep my extra pawn, I'm going to commit myself. I'm going to play f4 one day. And so that's a move that fits with the position. How we assess this position, that's a different matter. Maybe black is very, very happy because he has two bishops and a safe king. White's king, there are some light square weaknesses over there. So it's not a cut and dry deal that this is all good for white. But these are the ways that I would look at the king's Indian. I would fight my way through, and I would really look at it as from the point of view of structure. Like I'm very, very happy. Oh, praise be the Lord. I'm a pawn up. Very, very happy about the extra pawn. But equally, I'm actually very happy that you have a pawn on d5. Not because I really want to take it, but really because if this pawn were gone, I would be a little bit worried about this open diagonal, right? So in one way, I might say, long time in the future, this pawn on d5 is a weakness. But for the moment, I'm really glad that it's on the board, and it's impinging the power of the light square bishop. And this is the way I would walk myself through openings. And there's such a, are you guys familiar with Encyclopedia of Chess Openings? The 5-volume series, version 1s, 2s, and 3s. I mean, there's tens of thousands of openings and defenses. And how are you going to determine which one suits you or not? You can't give a half an hour to each and every one. I mean, then you're 50 years old. So you have to somehow cut and make shortcuts the openings and defenses that you choose, and that was how I did it. I was looking at from structures and what structures I felt suited me. For example, I felt very suited to the French defense structure because it was very easy, simple for me to understand, and I knew where my pieces went. Other people, different ideas. For me, I liked the English opening. That was 1c4. Can I have another, give me another opening and defense, and we can just go through it very quickly as to how I would approach it. Matt, what's your favorite defense to 1e4?
Scandinavian, maybe?
Okay, very good. This is an excellent. Also, one thing that I think a lot of people have to understand about openings is openings are a bit of a fashion statement. They suddenly it's like everybody and his brother and sister are happily playing a particular opening or defense, and then it's like the very next day it's out of style, out of fashion. When I was a kid, the Scandinavian, I mean, what kid didn't start playing chess without, knowing the Scandinavian? And then it just kind of like, I don't know if it's a level of maturity, if it kind of just simply fell out of favor, the Scandinavian. But I really don't know what's wrong with the Scandinavian defense. I think it's a very good opening for black. And so much so I'm sitting there going, it was in 1995, I beg your pardon. I'm in New York, the World Trade Towers. I'm like on the 110th floor, and it's the match Kasparov white, Anand black. And Kasparov is just playing e4 to win. He plays e4, and Vishy just rolls out the Scandinavian defense with d5 and draws very simply with black. So, I mean, if Garry Kasparov doesn't have a refutation to the Scandinavian defense, and why is it not more popular today? Well, maybe a question of fashion. So after e takes d5, you actually have two major choices. One is knight f6 and one is queen d. I assume you would follow up with the queen d5 line? Yeah, okay. So queen takes d5. So knight c3, and basically everybody and his brother plays queen a5 or queen d6 or queen d8. Young men.
Can we take a look at knight f6?
Oh, sure. We'll come back to that. So essentially, let's just go with queen a5 for the moment. Let's go with d4. Let's go with knight f6. And we're getting close to a near tabia position of the Scandinavian. Now here, black has to make some critical choices. Does he want to castle long? Does he want to castle long? Should he play lines with bishop g4, knight c6, and castles long, which are very, very sharp? Yeah? Should he play lines that are solid with c7, c6, bishop g4, e7, e6? And it's almost a Caro-Kann-like structure where white's knight, instead of being, say, on the square g3, is on the square c3. Your choice, Matt. How do you go? Knight c6, yes?
Oh,
Pawn c6 is your choice. I beg your pardon. And I'm...
Yasser,
Yes.
I offer an optional theory.
Sure.
Since in this particular position, if you
Before the move
castle,
c6.
if you choose to think of future castle on the queen side, you gain a temple for black because your castle will land with an instant temple on d8. So if you're thinking queen side castling, coupling with your movements, you gain a quick free temple with your castle. King gets nothing, and your instant temple gain with your well-positioned d8. In addition to the other pieces, so all of a sudden you've got this extra juice going.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that that's a major choice in this position, is to play bishop g4 with the idea of accelerating your play by bringing your rook to d8, putting pressure on the d4 pawn. And it's not everybody's choice, because the lines are very, very sharp. Perhaps you have some experience with that. Sorry, so c7, c6. And that, if I recall, doesn't everybody play bishop c4 or bishop d2 here? Right. And then do you like to play the line with bishop g4 or bishop f5?
Well, I play bishop g4. It looks like bishop f5 is really, really popular.
Yes, exactly. It's okay. I mean, this is your line, your defense. Okay. And now, how do you meet h2, h3?
I just take the knight.
You take the knight. Okay. Which is fine. Everything is fine. Takes. I assume you're playing knight d7 or e6.
E6.
Okay. So now, actually, from Matt's point of view, Matt plays this as a choice, and I think it's a very easy choice he can live with. So the first thing we do is we kind of take a look at the structure, and we say, well, these two pawns being on e6 and c6, it's a real good thing we've traded off our light squared bishop. Like, we don't have to worry about it anymore. Secondly, we can say that the pawn on d4 gives white a space edge. Well, power to him. Gives him control of the e5 and c5 squares, but with the knight on c3, it's not going to be that easy for white to bring his knights to those outposts. From black's point of view, he's got a great outpost sitting here on d5. It's just beckoning. So moves like knight d7, knight b6, bishop b4, going for control of the d5 square are just too natural. We can just expect these types of things. Not everybody's cup of tea, but white should be happy he's ahead the two bishops. We do consider this a kind of a plus. But this is the type of structure, by the way, that I really like to play, even today, because I find the ideas so easy. I'm not going to be shocked. I mean, there's not going to be some surprising move that wipes me out. Yeah? And I think your results are you happy with your results?
Yeah.
Yeah, which is very good. And that's really also the other thing, too, is specializing. There comes times in your chess cycle, your skills that you want to specialize. First of all, you want to specialize and really, really know your opening and your defense inside and out. So you really feel confident when you come to the board that you're not going to be surprised. So it's very, very good to specialize. Then later, after you reach a real mature level of skill, you discover that sometimes you've fallen into a rut and your game has become apathetic. You're not growing, you're not challenging yourself enough. It's sort of like you've mastered one thing and you don't want to move from it. That's the only thing you're interested in. And so you have to change your openings for other reasons. But before all of that happens, of course, I suggest specializing. And in this case, power to you, Matt. You found a specialty, the Scandinavian, that I think is actually a very reasonable and decent option. Any questions? I've overwhelmed you.
Can we examine the line where?
Yes, knight f6.
Queenside castling.
Oh, sure.
So this is going to go to a kingside castle.
Yeah.
The kingside castle is very easy.
Sure.
Let's look at another approach, quickly, a variation where we emphasize the queenside castle.
Okay. So the first point is black has to be already very careful with his move order. Okay? So knight d4. No, hold on. Queen takes knight here. Queen at d4. Knight f6, knight f6. Okay. So black already has to be very careful with his move order. For example, it would be a mistake to play knight c6 here because d5 comes with a tempo. The knight is going to have to move. Knight takes d5, queen takes d5 as a showstopper. Knight can't jump here or here. The knight would have to come to b4. Bishop check is a very unpleasant check. c7, c6 doesn't get us the variation. So we have to go back and we have to say, okay, in this position, bishop g4. So we can't play knight c6. Now, however, we're thinking to ourselves, we're ready to play knight c6 in castles because we don't worry about d4, d5. Okay, so I was black, I think against Michael Rode, and he played h3. Now, I didn't take Matt's choice to heart. I could take the knight, queen takes, and I think after a move like c7, c6, kind of transpose to what you did, my opponent, I went here, yeah? And now, what did Michael do? I think Michael went here, bishop c4. Now here, I didn't try knight c6. I think I played the move e7, e6. I played e6. I think this had a problem. G4 then D5, something like that. I know that there's a tactical problem. So I went E7, E6. He went G4. I went bishop here. And he went knight E5. Knight E5. I'm having trouble remembering the line. It was a very long time ago. Queen e2. Now, on the one hand, I was very happy with the black pieces because I have provoked my opponent into ultra aggression mode, and he's advanced these pawns. And I'm very hopeful that one, in the future they're going to prove a weakness and a source of counterplay for me, and two, it really means that I now have a good guess about the address of the white king, and it's not going to go kingside because the pawn shield has been weakened, but rather it's going to go queenside. All brilliant, of course, but I still failed horribly and lost like a child.